Reading the Times for Sunday, March 1st, 2020. Winning South Carolina, Biden makes case against Sanders. Win big or lose. Perhaps even more consequentially, Mr. Biden's triumph here also increased pressure on Michael R. Bloomberg to best Mr. Biden in the 15 states and territories voting Tuesday or consider exiting the race. Today is a great day because I tell you what, the full comeback starts in South Carolina. Mr. Biden, anticipating victory, said at a campaign rally in North Carolina earlier in the day. Mr. Biden has led in every poll of South Carolina, but after his Nevada landslide, Mr. Sanders decided to try to deliver a finishing blow against Mr. Biden. Taliban and U.S. strike deal to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan. The United States is expected to sign a peace deal with the Taliban insurgency on Saturday that, for the first time after 2 decades of grinding warfare, would lay out the prospect of a final withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. If the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan live up to these commitments, we will have a powerful path forward to end the war in Afghanistan and bring our troops home, President Trump said on Friday ahead of the signing of the deal, which he dispatched Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to attend. The insurgents had to pledge to break with international terrorist networks and forbid Afghanistan's to use as a base of attacks by groups like Al-Qaeda, which launched the September 11th terrorist attacks on the United States from the haven the Taliban granted in Afghanistan. After 18 years, is this Afghan peace or just a way out? Mr. Trump has long lamented the cost of endless wars, and by the time he took up direct negotiations with the Taliban, he knew American voters were interested mostly in one thing: ending participation in a war that has now dragged on for more than 18 years. Its objectives always shifting. If the Afghan government can reach its own accord with the Taliban in a so-called intra-Afghan process that is now supposed to begin, the American troop levels may drop further, officials say. The purpose of the Kabul ceremony was to reassure Mr. Ghani that the American and NATO troops would not go anywhere until the Afghan government and the Taliban reach their own accord. How prepared is the U.S. for a coronavirus outbreak? Public health experts worry that the efforts to contain an outbreak could be hamstrung by budget cuts that have weakened state health departments. Although public health experts in the United States say walling off entire cities and shutting down transport systems would most likely be counterproductive and do more harm than good, federal and state laws give governments the authority to limit civil liberties to protect the public health. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex M. Azar III, told reporters on Friday that 300 million of such masks, known as N95s, are needed for the emergency medical stockpile for healthcare workers, and that the government was considering invoking a Korean War-era law to accelerate production domestically. Coronavirus tests limits of central bank firepower. We should have the lowest interest rate. We don't have the lowest interest rates. The Fed rate is higher. The president, who has repeatedly faulted the Fed for not slashing rates more aggressively, criticized it again on Saturday, saying it was putting the United States at a disadvantage with other countries with negative interest rates. In South Korea, where rates are low but positive, the central bank surprised investors by leaving interest rates unchanged on Thursday, even as the country struggles with the largest known coronavirus outbreak outside of China. The Pied Pipers of the dirtbag left want to lead everyone to Bernie Sanders. The podcast has also morphed into a touring political rally. In addition to the Iowa show, the Chapo crew went to New Hampshire and Nevada, and they have a handful of dates in California leading up to Super Tuesday, filling large venues, a bunch of self-serious PMCs. Over the summer, the Chapo Trap House message board, which has nearly 153,000 members who chat about the news and memes of the day, was censured by Reddit, which hosts it. Toward the end of the show, the crowd, by then frenzied and a little drunk, periodically broke out into chants of the Sanders slogan, "Not me, us." And finally, with the Chapo host leading, they stood and sang "Solidarity Forever," the old trade union anthem. For Seoul's poor, class strife in Parasite is daily reality. The movie does so thorough the tale of a family in Seoul who lives in a banjiha, or a semi-basement home, like Mr. Kim's, and whose initially hilarious subterfuge to latch onto a wealthy family unravels tragically. The fictionalized story reflects the lives of Seoul's so-called dirt spoons, the urban poor, many of whom live in semi-basements in the congested city, where living high and dry in apartment towers and away from the honking, yelling, odoriferous squalor of down below symbolizes the wealth and status of the gold spoon class. In Seoul, wealth is measured by how high you live, said Kim Nam-sik, a real estate agent in Seoul's quiet Seongbuk district, home to dozens of foreign ambassadors' residences, and where the rich family of Parasite lives. Malaysia's premier, Mahathir Mohamad, is ousted in a surprising turn on Monday after his governing coalition, called the Alliance of Hope, collapsed under the weight of internal rivalries and ideological contradictions. Mr. Mahathir resigned, only to have the king name him as interim prime minister. Mr. Muhyiddin is a leader of the Malaysian United Indigenous Party, which Mr. Mahathir has helmed until less than a week ago. Though Mr. Muhyiddin's swearing in as prime minister has a time and a place, 10:30 a.m. Sunday at the National Palace, few were willing to count out Mr. Mahathir, even at 94, just yet. Hedge fund may push for ouster of Jack Dorsey as Twitter's CEO. One of Wall Street's most powerful activist hedge funds has taken a stake in Twitter and intends to shake up the social network, including by potentially calling for the replacement of its founder, Jack Dorsey, as chief executive. Two people briefed on the matter said on Saturday. Though Elliott has a number of concerns, its biggest is the fact that Mr. Dorsey currently is the chief executive title at both Twitter and another business he founded, the financial company Square. One of the people briefed on the matter said, in the fourth quarter of last year, Twitter generated more than $1 billion in revenue, a first for the company. Israel, startup nation, groans under strains of growth and neglect. Thousands of patients a year are dying from infections in Israel's hospitals, the most overcrowded in the developed world. Karnit Flug, governor of the Bank of Israel from 2013 to 2018, traced Israel's neglect of vital civilian spending needs to a belt tightening that began in the early 2000s after the dot-com bust. Mr. Feldman said it would cost Israel $6 billion more a year to catch up to the developed world, but Israelis are too willing to count their blessings rather than lobby for change. The driving force in Irish politics? Find a decent place to live. Ireland is in the grip of a housing crisis so severe that it has rendered thousands of people homeless and hollowed out a social contract that for decades has allowed many Irish people to purchase a home. A few days after the election in Dublin, constituency of Sinn Féin's leader Mary Lou McDonald, Miss O'Keefe gathered with young people affected by the housing crisis for an open door support group, a place for people to bring their complaints about landlords and organize. The group, the Dublin Central Housing Action, has taken part in a high-profile occupation of disused offices or hotels that activists have turned into homeless shelters. and in confrontations with landlords at the homes of people facing evictions. Erdogan says we open the doors and clashes erupt as migrants head for Europe. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey declared on Saturday that he has opened his country's borders for migrants to cross into Europe, saying that Turkey could no longer handle the numbers fleeing the war in Syria. His comments were the first to acknowledge what he had long threatened to do, and came after hundreds of migrants in Turkey headed to the land border between Greece and Turkey, and by sea to Greek islands, journeys apparently facilitated by Turkish authorities. Mr. Erdogan's comments also came after Turkey suffered heavy losses from Russian or Syrian airstrikes in northwestern Syria on Thursday, and as Turkey seeks American and European support for its Syrian operations. Top UK civil servant quits and vows to sue, accusing Minister of vicious behavior. Mr. Rutnam, a 33-year veteran of the government, said he had clashed repeatedly with Ms. Patel over her management of the Home Office, one of the most powerful ministries in the British government, whose immigration responsibilities gave it a major role in shaping Britain's departure from the European Union. Mr. Rutman said he believed his treatment was part of a wider pattern of abuse in the government, which has been in a state of near constant personnel upheaval since Mr. Johnson's Conservative Party won a commanding majority in Parliament in last December's general election. With Mr. Rutman's bitter resignation, in which he accused Ms. Patel of lying, the tensions in Mr. Johnson's government has spilled into public view. Why a coronavirus recession would be so hard to contain. The core of the economic problem emerging from coronavirus is a supply shock, meaning a reduction in the economy's capacity to make things. A store with no goods on the shelves has a supply problem, while a store with a full shelf but no customer has a demand problem. The role of the economic policy in that sense wouldn't be to solve the supply shock, but try to prevent the initial supply shock from triggering a demand shock. Where do I find your hand sanitizer? Sorry, we have none. As the coronavirus spreads and people clamor to protect themselves from getting sick, the United States, like other countries, is seeing high demand for items like masks and hand sanitizer. On Amazon, a search for popular hand sanitizers, brands like Purell, Germex, or even Amazon's private label brand Solimo showed many were unavailable. Purell says its spray disinfectants, which are used for household cleaning and are regulated by Environmental Protection Agency, have demonstrated effectiveness against a strain of the human coronavirus. But the Federal Drug Administration, which regulates hand sanitizers, sent a warning letter to Gojo in January, telling the company to stop marketing claims that hand sanitizers could prevent infections from things like Ebola virus, norovirus, and MRSA. The FDA said those claims were not supported by any adequate and well-controlled studies. Making a pledge movie with coronavirus on the doorstep. Last Saturday, Nicholas Holbert, a British film director, flew from London to Venice for his latest project. Mr. Holbert said the text was the main moment he realized that making a film about people hiding from a life-threatening disease has suddenly collided with a real-life event, a fast-spreading and dangerous coronavirus outbreak. Despite the film crew's isolation, the outbreak had been on everyone's minds. In graying Japan, many are vulnerable, but few are being tested. Whatever the motivation, given Japan's large aging population, about 29% of its 36 million people are 65 or older. Experts say the country's testing gap could leave the most vulnerable people exposed, which reported on Saturday the case in the country has risen to 3,150. Has offered drive-through testing in Daegu, a hard-hit city, and other places, while in Hong Kong, clinics have begun to give residents kits that allow them to take the test at home and send them to a lab. You wonder if they were testing nearly as much as South Korea is testing. What would the actual number be? How many cases are lurking or just not being caught? Said Tobias Harris, an expert on Japanese policy at Teneo Intelligence in Washington. Why Afghanistan became an invisible war. Even today, the number of veterans still alive from World War II and the Vietnam War each exceed the number of Afghan war veterans. A small portion of military spending in Afghanistan has been every bit as expensive as any war in the last 75 years, with the exception of World War II. The United States has spent about $2 trillion over 18 years, more than $100 billion a year. In recent years, war was the subject of fewer front-page stories in the New York Times than any other war since World War I. After an initial spike in coverage following September 11th attacks, the war in Afghanistan rarely appeared more than once a week on the front page. 4 takeaways from the U.S. deal with the Taliban over the years. Even as Qaeda has decimated by years of U.S. military operations, the Taliban refused to publicly disavow the group, which still pledges allegiance to the Taliban supreme leader. The United States also committed to working to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners who are held by the Afghan government and 1,000 from the Afghan side by March 10th, before the Afghan sides are expected to sit down for direct negotiations. The agreement between the United States and the Taliban unlocks the difficult but crucial next step: negotiations between the Taliban and other Afghans, including the government, over future power sharing. In prosperous California, anxiety over inequality abounds. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who has built a large organization in California and has campaigned extensively in the state, including at a rally in Bakersfield recently, has a commanding lead in the polls, underscoring how his campaign's theme of inequality has resonated with Democrats in California. The state's decision to move its primary to Super Tuesday 3 months earlier than in 2016 will only serve to make California's voice more decisive. While California is one of the world's wealthiest places, if it were a country, it would be the world's 5th largest economy. It also has the United States' highest poverty rate when housing costs are factored in. Joe Biden had a big night. He needs another in 72 hours. If a commanding victory in a place like South Carolina, built to reward Mr. Biden's strengths with black voters, helped mask some of his weaknesses for 1 week, his fate ahead of Super Tuesday is still shadowed by the preceding failures of both Mr. Biden's campaign and the candidate himself. Top Democratic officials in key battleground states that go to the polls Tuesday, from Alabama to Texas, have said that Mr. Bloomberg poses an acute threat to Mr. Biden, eating at his standing with moderate voters. Voters do not always behave ideologically, a fact that cuts both ways for Mr. Sanders, as Mr. Biden banks on a boost if other center-left candidates drop out. Some of that support will drift to Mr. Sanders, even if voters do not align precisely with him on policy. How South Carolina could change the Democratic race. South Carolina signifies a turning point in the campaign. Candidates have been courting black voters in the state for more than a year, and now the Democratic hopefuls will see if their personal appeals and policy plans catch fire, with the first predominantly black electorate to vote in the race. Black voters know white voters better than white voters know themselves, Mr. Richardson said. Mr. Bloomberg has spent hundreds of millions of dollars courting voters, who with particular attention to black voters and Latino voters in delegate-rich states such as Texas and California, which vote on Tuesday. For Buttigieg, a search for black support that never arrived. On February 20th, 2 weeks after Iowa, right? Mr. Buttigieg told supporters he needed to raise $13 million by Super Tuesday, to stay competitive. On Friday, his campaign manager wrote, he wrote me in an email, solicitations. Hold up. He told me Buttigieg is more than halfway towards that goal, right? Mr. Buttigieg kicked off the day before primary with another monochrome campaign stop, Charleston, South Carolina, I think. He was sitting up front with Phyllis Johnson, an African-American Air Force retiree, right? She said she admired the dude's youth. She liked the kid, right? Military service, his eloquent manner of speaking. Later Friday, Buttigieg stops in Sumter for what his campaign billed as a community conversations on environmental justice, some bullshit. Aides placed a 2-page summary of Mr. Buttigieg's Douglas plan for black empowerment. Like this. His aides, 2-page summary, right? Hold up. His age placed a two-page summary of his black empowerment plan on each one of the 100 chairs. Every single chair, right? Oh my gosh, every single chair killed me. He's a good kid, though. Tom Steyer drops out of the 2020 presidential race. As his rivals fought amid the crowded Democratic field to gain a foothold in Iowa, New Hampshire, Mr. Steyer campaign saw an opportunity to saturate South Carolina voters with television ads and direct mail, while also building out a large campaign operation, making dozens of visits to the state. Mr. Steyer's campaign made commercial rent payments to a company owned by Jennifer Clyburn Reed, a daughter of James E. Clyburn, the longtime Democratic congressman from South Kakalaka, whose endorsement was highly coveted and eventually went to former President Joseph R. Biden. Mr. Steyer's campaign also put influential black lawmakers on his campaign payroll as advisors, some of who endorsed him, and faced allegations of vote buying, all of which raised concerns among some South Kakalaka Democrats. In the days before the primary, Mr. Steyer's South Kakalaka staff had swelled to more than 100 workers, many of them young and black South Kakalakans. Fighting coal was supposed to lift Bloomberg. Here's why it didn't. After 9 months, we said, we think you can shut down a third of the coal fleet in 4 years, said Bruce Mills, the managing director at the Rocky Mountain Institute, who previously ran Beyond Coal campaign and advises Mr. Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg, he came out and said, I'm not going to shut down coal. He said, I'm going to shut down coal. And he did. He did that on a barge in front of a coal plant in Virginia. Since 2010, about 246 coal plants have closed, while another 60 have announced plans to shut down, about 40% of coal generating capacity in the United States. Why candidates got the most speaking time? Which candidates got the most speaking time in the Democratic debate? Tell me. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, former Mayor Michael R. Bloomberg of New York, and Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota had the most speaking time of the 7 Democratic presidential candidates in the debate in Charleston, South Carolina, ahead of the South Carolina primary on Saturday. Almost every candidate criticized Mr. Sanders in the first 10 minutes of the debate, challenging his electability, health care plan, and record on gun control. The increasing threat of the spread of the coronavirus became a topic of debate for the first time, with candidates criticizing the Trump administration preparations for an outbreak, and Mr. Bidet referring to the Obama administration's efforts to combat the Ebola virus. Who will win on Super Tuesday? Here's what the polls show in 6 key states. Welcome to Poll Watch, our weekly look at polling data and survey research on the candidates, voters, and issues that will shape the 2020 election. A recent University of Massachusetts Lowell poll conducted by YouGov showed Mr. Sanders edging ahead with 23% support, Mr. Bloomberg at 19%, and Mr. Bidet with 16%. The 2 liberal senators have been running about neck and neck, according to the most recent polls, though a WBUR poll released Friday shows Mr. Sanders jumping out to an 8-point lead. Mr. Bidet remains in the running, sustained by his lead among non-white voters, and Mr. Buttigieg is also polling consistently in the mid-teens. For American military, coronavirus is an enemy to be fought. The commander of an American military post near the center of a coronavirus outbreak in South Korea delivered the sobering news to his troops in warrior terms. Men, we've had a breach in our perimeter. United States Forces Korea announced on Thursday it was canceling annual joint military exercises with the South Korean military. Men, you have great resources, great monitoring, but the needs of the military can also make the military more vulnerable. Trump moves to calm fears as first U.S. death from coronavirus is reported. Presiding over an abruptly announced news conference in the White House briefing room and flanked by top public health officials, Mr. Trump, who has drawn criticism for his response to the virus, warned that additional coronavirus cases in the United States are likely, but added that healthy individuals should be able to fully recover. In a news conference, Mr. Trump described the person as a medically high-risk woman in her late 50s. Dr. Robert R. Redfield, the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, said there was no evidence that the patient had traveled recently or had contact with someone known to have the virus, adding to growing signs that the virus might be spreading in the United States. Qatar confirmed its first case of the virus on Saturday, its health minister said, bringing the number of countries where the virus has been detected to at least 57. Education Department to cut off federal funding for some rural schools. Congress created the Rural Education Achievement Program, recognizing the rural schools lacked the resources to compete with their urban and suburban counterparts for competitive grants. In the latest report, Why Rural Matters, the Rural School and Community Trust found that many districts face nothing less than an emergency. Nearly 1 in 6 students living in rural areas lives below the poverty line, 1 in 7 qualifies for special education services, and 1 in 9 has changed residences in the past 12 months. The report says, I know that's a lot of numbers. Try to keep up. Rural education advocates definitely hoped that a president elected, in part because of rural and small town voters, would pay more attention to rural children, said Alan Richard, a board member of Rural School and Community Trust. At CPAC, Trump takes aim at rivals. President Trump crouched underneath his microphone on Saturday, mimicking the height of Michael R. Bloomberg, the billionaire former mayor of New York City, who is running for president. Mr. Bloomberg, whose mammoth spending has privately concerned Mr. Trump, writes checks like a drunken sailor, the president said, ribbing the former mayor for spending more than $500 million on a presidential bid that Mr. Trump predicted would not make it past Super Tuesday on March 3rd. That's probably the worst debate performance in the history of presidential debates, he said of Mr. Bloomberg's debut this month on the debate stage, which was widely viewed as a bubble-bursting showing for a potential dark horse candidate. Mr. Trump has been a regular speaker at CPAC for years and has credited the organization for giving him a platform long before he officially declared his run for presidency. For migrants at the border, a day of hopes uplifted and dashed. The stringent Trump administration border policy has kept thousands of asylum seekers trapped in Mexico The stringent Trump administration border policy that has kept thousands of asylum seekers trapped in Mexico would keep them waiting a while longer. The policy has forced migrants to wait in Mexico for months while their asylum cases are reviewed in Tijuana, south of the California city of San Diego. More than 50 asylum seekers marched to the port of entry, singing about winning asylum and helping one another carry their luggage. Sanders looks to topple Warren in her home state. Mr. Sanders has similarly added an event in Minnesota, the home state of Senator Amy Klobuchar, although her continued presence in the race is largely viewed as bleeding votes from other Sanders rivals, rather than hurting him. One survey from the University of Massachusetts, Lowell, taken after the New Hampshire primary, but before Mr. Sanders won Nevada, showed a statistical dead heat with Mr. Sanders at 21% and Ms. Warren at 20%. In recent weeks, Mr. Sanders has spent about $400,000 on television ads in Boston, Springfield, and Providence, Rhode Island. On Thursday, Sanders volunteers began organizing a 4-day Bernie Palooza. As Skeptical looks as Lollapalooza, but it's Bernie in Worcester, Massachusetts, complete with musical acts and door knocking across the state. Who will care for society's forgotten? We rarely think about how they receive medical care, and yet how and whether we treat these patients, especially at the end of their lives, this moral measuring stick that is all too often missing in our discussions about health care in America. House Call Providers, a home care organization in Portland, provides palliative care to these very vulnerable patients, typically through Medicaid, Medicare, or what's called dual eligibility. We all need hope and care when we are sick, and shelter to make that care practicable. The Harvey Weinstein verdict is a watershed and a warning. We have something else instead, from personal life to national politics, a hierarchy of audibility and credibility, a brutal hierarchy in which people with facts often cannot prevail because those who have more power push those facts out of the room into silence or make the cost of stating those facts dangerously high. More than 90 women have reported he harassed or assaulted them. But Mr. Weinstein had what money can buy: an international army of lawyers, spies, influencers, and others toiling to control the story, keep his secrets. To be powerless means that your facts and your truths can be overwhelmed by the powerful who prefer these facts or voices or stories not to be heard. We have, to take on the coronavirus, go medieval on it. The Chinese leader Xi Jinping was able to seal off the city of Wuhan where the COVID-19 outbreak began, because China is a place where a leader can ask himself, what would Mao do, and just do it. The White House, in defiance of recent American history, also opted to go medieval by aggressive measures like barring entry to non-Americans who are recently in China and advising Americans to not go to China. South Korea, the head of the WHO team that visited China, said this week that China took one of the most ancient strategies and rolled out one of the most ambitious, agile, and aggressive disease containment efforts in history. White supremacy goes green. So from France to Washington to New Zealand, angry voices on the hard right, nationalist, populist, and others beyond conventional conservatism are picking up old environmental tropes and adapting them to a moment charged with fear for the future. The neo-Nazi group Northwest Front, which advocates expelling people of color from the Pacific Northwest, appropriated a flag designed by a left-wing activist, reframing it with the slogan, the sky is the blue and the land is the green, the white is for the people in between. In Slovakia, a far-right activist invoking centrality of forest to national identity accused members of the Roma ethnic minority of damaging them with excessive firewood gathering. Balsa Lubarda, a Central European University doctoral candidate studying the radical right, told me, as climate change reshapes our world, we face a future filled with new pressures and constraints on resources, including arable land, food, and water. My ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend is Lady Gaga. So Page 6 produced a deep dive into Lady Gaga's new mystery man. Refinery 29 announced that Gaga was wearing 2020's hottest new accessory, a normal boyfriend. The story appeared in the Daily Mail, the Business Insider, and People, where my mother read about the couple after checking the magazine out from the local library. The point is, Lady Gaga is living the ambitious life that we keep saying women should embrace. If Lady Gaga can do what she wants and even expand on what she wants, why not me too? Why not let being exactly who I am mean trying to be the best I could be? Lady Gaga continues to challenge herself to try new things to thrive. Shit, she could have that old... Israel's Rihanna is Arab and Jewish. The movies have cult status not just among Israeli Arabs like Nasreen's family, 1/5 of the population, but also among Israeli Jews, about half of whom have family roots in the Middle East or North Africa. She's navigating a country that is simultaneously more open to its own Arab spirit and more suspicious of Arabs. A country where Nasreen can show up on TV at the Big Brother house, dedicate a song to one of the residents, the Israeli Arab transgender beauty queen, Dalin Abu Hana, and also the country that recently passed the nation-state law which downgraded the status of Arabic as the official language. Nasreen criticized the law in a radio interview, saying I canceled the language of my mother and father, my neighbors, and millions of Arabs who live here. The law was championed by politicians like Miri Regev, whose own family spoke Arabic a generation or two ago and who thinks Israeli culture should learn from Arabic music. My daughter, she passes for white. I stand in the aisle of the school bus while the other 7th graders snicker and they block me from sitting next to them. And for the entire school year they do this shit, right? My great aunt adorned in a colorful sari. She waves goodbye to me while the entire school bus looks on. My bullies in school, they all look like the daughter. I have now. From Black Hawk to brain surgery to bride? Doc, said in a clipped voice, we've got a 9-year-old girl who was in the rear passenger in a 2-car collision about 2 hours ago. She's just arrived. The scans show a 3 centimeter subdural hematoma on the right side of her brain. We've a small show. Can you take her? We're a small show. Can you take her? The pupil typically dilates on the side of the brain with the increased pressure. In the case of the right side, as the brain is forced down and away from the blood clot. The operating room team was ready for the girl. The sterile instruments laid out on the back tables. Blue drapes applied after quick clipping of her hair. Lightning fast wash of her head with sterilization prep solution. Here comes the coronavirus pandemic. Back in 2002, when the SARS virus made its fateful leap from bats to civet cats to humans, global health experts warned that ensuing outbreak was a harbinger of things to come. The climate change and globalization were conspiring with an array of other forces to make it much easier for old animal diseases to morph into new human ones. Imagine something as contagious as measles, only many times more deadly. You have a good sense of what keeps global health officials up at night. The World Health Organization has corrected many of the institutional shortcomings that thwarted its responses to previous outbreaks. Are men not listening to women? Women can fail to listen as well, as when millions of women who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 failed to engage in what Dr. Probulus calls feminist listening by not heeding the advice of women who call attention to Mr. Trump's abusive sexism, rather than pit men against women in their listening, which tends to be decisive. It would be more useful to suggest strategies by which both men and women can learn to engage in more humane, gender egalitarian listening behavior. If the first step to change is awareness that there's an issue, I encourage men to start paying attention to how often it's the men who dominate the conversation in a mixed group, and the women who just listen politely can't seem to break in. To how about when a man and a woman are conversing, the woman asks about the man and his life, and the man has asked nothing about the woman. How often the men expound on a topic they know little about, when the silent woman in the midst is an expert. Is this coronavirus the big one? Bill Gates, for years he's been warning presciently about the danger of pandemics, bluntly cautions that the virus could be the once-in-a-century pandemic. Dr. Peter J. Hotz, he's an expert on global health at Baylor University. He emphasized to me personally the need to support frontline health workers to keep them from being infected. He says that health workers, they lose confidence and things just start to fall apart. It's like my marriage. Trump makes us ill. Mike Huckabee on the attack, asserting that Trump could personally suck the virus out of every one of the 60,000 people in the world, suck it out of the lungs, swim to the bottom of the oceans, and spill it out, and he would be accused of pollution for messing up the ocean. Trump seems more consumed with how the Democrats might blame him for a coronavirus recession than for the virus itself. The president got it together the same day with a group that included his social media boosters, Diamond and Silk. At the White House press conference, Trump preened, because of all we've done, the risk to American people remains very low. He later said that one day, like a miracle, the virus will disappear. Jewish women move into a male domain. Ritual circumcision. A month before her due date, and still without a molehill, Dr. Brown read an article about Dr. Dania Rumbach, a pediatrician, and a molehill, and felt huge relief, she said, thinking that Dr. Rumbach, as a woman, would bring empathy to a procedure that is so often rote. For the breeze at Dr. Brown's house, Dr. Rumbach told the parents they could call her anytime with questions. Dr. Emily Blake, a molehill in Rockland County, is often asked how long women have been in the brie business. How a downtown bar baron spends his Sundays. While Natalie is toasting, I will knock out social media. That's what Sunday is, a chance to hang out with friends. I came out of the apartment, right? I parked my car. I tromped into the rain. Coronavirus in New York. It's coming. Should we panic or shrug? Last spring, health officials from New York and New Jersey conducted an exercise in disease preparedness that involved 70 people and a pretend Ebola patient who was transported 41 miles to Bellevue Hospital on the east side of Manhattan. In New York, the doctor's fiancé and friends were quarantined. A bowling alley where he had been in Brooklyn was temporarily shut down. The caution suggested by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention for those who contract the virus but don't need to be hospitalized are the sort of measures that might be workable in Denver or Houston, but seem less so in New York, where the average size of an apartment building built during the past 20 years is 866 feet. I only drink my coffee black, and I cannot drink it with sugar. There are 5 of us, all 18 years old, and from either the Bronx or New Jersey. Welcome to Times Square, or as we like to call it, the heartbeat of New York City. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere, perhaps with a transfer to the 127 ACENQR or W. In January, having moved back to New York permanently, I eagerly scheduled a cleaning with plans to share the news of my... Scheduled a cleaning with plans to share... What the fuck? Oh, cleaning of teeth. We're talking about teeth. A French Revolution in New York. Indoor soccer. These were the cheers of supporters who'd come to see their friends and relatives play at Socceroof, a 75,000 square foot indoor soccer facility with 10 fields, and in-house bar, and pretty good views of the Statue of Liberty. Hundreds of teams find themselves competing for permits to play on the city's public soccer fields. There are only 259 of them, all maintained by the Department of Parks and Recreation. And the kids get to play soccer, and the parents, they get to go to the bar. New York City lost boxing. At one point in time, there were fights every weekend in almost every borough, said Bruce Silverglade, who runs Gleason's Boxing Gym, the iconic Brooklyn Fight Club. Fighters cannot enter the sport of boxing and become a fighter and make a living at it. He said, boutique boxing clubs like Bout, Rumble, and Shadowbox opened in New York with high-energy classes, high-tech equipment, and a price tag to match. At Rumble, a package of 30 group classes cost $900. But what kept me afloat are the hipsters who came to train, said Ray Quadrado, a president of amateur boxing in New York, owner of Brotherhood Boxing in Bushwick. When it's this easy at the top, it's harder for everyone else. It's a club within the Legends Club, and there's nothing particularly unique about it. Just more gray suede couches, another bar, and some TVs. The only thing that makes the Harmon Lounge special is that it's restricted to fans sitting in the first row, and only the first row. As the rich get richer and more businesses focus exclusively on serving them, there's less attention and shabbier service for everybody who's not at the pinnacle. Ordinary experiences deteriorate in quality, and the motivation to pay more for an upgrade and better treatment become more urgent, even for Americans who don't consider themselves part of the elite. Is it okay to call someone tiger at work? Many people hear the phrase human resources and assume it refers to a collection of resources provided for the humans who work at a company. Human resources is defined in both the dictionaries of our land and the hearts of the C-suite executives are the portion of a company's exploitable resources that are human, as opposed to, say, the financial. Humans are resources of human resources. We are the plankton slowly pressure cooked over millions of years into black sludge capable of powering company vehicles. Will the economy re-elect Trump? Should it? A member of my own family, for example, explained privately why she continues to favor President Trump. According to Mr. Fair's most recent forecast, made at the end of January, Mr. Trump will receive 54.4% of the two-party vote in November, which is likely enough for a victory in the Electoral College. If voters can be persuaded to focus on the long-term implications of Mr. Trump's actions, rather than the current state of the economy, the eventual Democratic nominee will have a shot at victory. Laureen Powell's Jobs is putting her own dent in the universe. Laureen Powell Jobs is putting a job. Before I could interview Laureen Powell-Jobs, she wanted to interview me. While Miss Powell-Jobs has in recent years become increasingly ambitious with her business and philanthropy, she keeps a low profile, granting relatively few interviews and eschewing the spotlight. Her conviction has brought Miss Powell-Jobs off the sidelines and into some of the most contentious political fights of the day. Rich profits and dark messages from the market. No, not that market. For buy and hold investors who keep both stocks and bonds, it has been a reminder that those boring bonds can offset painful stock losses, making it easier to hang out for the long run. Though Wednesday, a fund that tracked the investment-grade long-term U.S. bond market, the Vanguard Long-Term Bond ETF, generated an 8.1% return so far this year. With rates as low as they are now, he said simple arithmetic shows that in a recession, both short-term interest rates and those for bonds will approach zero, or even be negative. Retiring, or hope so, saddled with student loans. Parent Plus loans basically fill the gap between what a child might qualify for with their own, which is usually not very much, and the cost of attendance, said Jessica Ferrastaro of Take Charge America, a nonprofit provider of student loan counseling for the National Foundation for Credit Counseling. Often, a student will max out federal student loans before turning to private or Parent Plus loans. The risks in co-signing a private loan include fewer repayment plan options, the possibility that the student will miss or skip payments, leaving the co-signer responsible, and an increase in the balance of the loan has adjustable interest rate, and the increase in the balance if the loan has an adjustable interest rate, said Laurie Charwinski, the AARP Public Policies Institute Director of Banking and Financing. My tireless quest for a tubeless wipe. Tube-free toilet paper has been discontinued. The message on Scott's tube-free page said, but it's still available at select retailers while supplies last. The brand actually made a decision to discontinue the product line 2019 to focus its efforts on Scott Comfort Plus and the flagship Scott 1000 toilet paper. Ms. Bleerich wrote, 7th generation's toilet paper is made from recycled office paper, and the kind that piles up next to the printer. That's been reading the Times Sunday, March 1st, 2020.